Master demonologist Grigory Petrov thickly wiped the sweat from his brow. His face was flush, not from exertion, but from excitement. He had at long last cracked the impossible problem. A decade of research and experimentation had yielded what he alone had thought was possible. The work of a demonologist was highly illegal and blasphemous by its nature. Being covert all these years made his work hard, and investors impossible, but it was all worth it. The ancient manuscripts he stole from the vampires hinted at it. The tomes from the dusty library of eternity in the halls of the mountain kings suggested how it could be powered, and every morality tale told to children was clear it wasn't to be attempted. Scrying for shreds of forbidden knowledge, Grigory had come to a whole new understanding of reality. Now standing in front of him on his desk was the impossible demon. A perfectly safe one. The demon on his workbench looked like none of the known forms of demon. It was tiny, no taller than a straw doll. Its red torso was topped with magically augmented muscles. Its limbs were long and gangly, with knobby knees and elbows. It stood on tiny hooves, no wider around than a copper half-glendy coin. Grigory leaned forward to better inspect its head, holding his Leviathan oil lamp close. It was hairless, like the rest of its body, and dominated by a single eye. He could just barely see two pinhole nostrils above its slit of a mouth through which it will never eat nor drink nor breathe. The two beings were all alone in the tiny, dark, low-ceilinged cellar that had become Grigory's makeshift lab. While it lacked a great many things, it was rich in privacy. The smell of the damp room didn't bother him, but the dampness did cause his papers to yellow and his ink to smudge. None of that was close to the top of his mind today. Giddy with excitement, Grigory gestured to a thick layer of loose yellowed papers covered in his scrawlings. In a shaky voice he said, "I command you to sort my notes." The tiny creature replied "Merp," and scampered across the workbench. The demonologist held his breath as he watched as the tiny imp surveyed its surroundings with its one big pure black eye. It saw the notes and scuttled over to sort them into theory, ritual, and techniques. It then sorted the pages into sequence before arranging them into a single stack, and hip-bumping each of the four sides to square the notes into an even stack. His critical eye for demons acknowledged that the imp could have been more efficient and was slower than the limits imposed by its strength. His brow furrowed. Were the enchantments of learning sinking? The imp should get better at every task, optimizing its paths and eliminating wasted movements. Satisfied with the neat stack of notes, it was time for the next test. Grigory cleared his throat and commanded, "Make me a horse." To a real demon, this is an invitation to a dozen different cascades of failure and rebellion. He deliberately gave an ambiguous command with the potential for a consent-boosted polymorph. This exact mistake has claimed the lives of countless novice demonologists. The tiny demon looked all over the worn workbench, then walked around the edge of the tabletop, and then sat down on its haunches and replied "Nerp." "Capital," Grigory exclaimed to the empty lab. "The bindings of task refusal are working." The patiently waiting demon briefly tilted its tiny leathery head and attempted to parse the non-task-related statement. Grigory leaned over to the drawer and pulled out a knife and a small block of wood. He placed them on the table in front of the imp, who was sitting patiently. "Make me a wooden horse." "Merp." In a flurry of activity, the imp started carving into the wooden block. Slivers of wood flew all over the desk, and before his eyes formed a model of a horse, true to life. Veins in its neck, smooth flowing mane, the tiny nostrils flared from exertion, its eyes smaller than a mustard seed, but clear and intelligent, a sculpture no longer than his finger that would shame a grandmaster. Grigory smiled as the enchantments of worldly knowledge were flowing, allowing a creature just moments old to know everything about the word and idea of a horse. He held the tiny wooden horse in the flickering lamplight to appreciate the countless tiny details. It was perfect in every regard. When he created the summoning ritual, its dexterity and skill was one of many unknowns. He theorized it was a consequence of the countless enchantments interacting, causing the demon to perform better than he had dared hope. Grigory leaned back, holding the freshly carved horse in one hand and the ebony totem of summoning he'd carved that morning in the other. The demon clearly did better work, steadier with cleaner lines. A surge of pride in his creation's obvious skill welled up in his chest. To prepare for the next set of tasks, he pulled a sizable lump of ebony from the shelf. He placed it in the center of the workbench along with his demonologist's toolbox. Not that another demonologist anywhere in the Empire would even recognize the exotic tools he'd collected and built over the years. This part of his plan was the riskiest. A self-sustaining recursion, opening up whole new vistas of economic possibility. Duplicate your own summoning totem at 1/10th the scale, down to the smallest details including ethereal, then summon and bind a demon to the totem. Repeat 10 times. The demon stood up and mewed merp, and immediately started to work. This piece was vastly more complex than the horse. The totem was completely covered in spidery arcane symbols, and the activation and linking of them was a dense textile of magic. Grigory cast a gesture of auras to closely monitor its progress. Like its skill with tools, its enchanting was the work of a master. Once the totem was carved and enchanted, all that remained was to summon and bind a fresh demon. The imp solemnly chanted Mirp Merp MRRR me Irp. Nothing happened. Its simple slit mouth, lacking teeth or a tongue or even lips, was holding it back from the final completion. Grigory leaned forward to intervene but paused. The imp tried to chant again. Still no telltale whoosh of summoning nor a crack of a binding. It hurried to some blank sheets near the recently stacked notes, tore off half a sheet, and frantically scrawled line after line of demonic script on it. It held one of Grigory's nibbed pens like a ferryman would hold a barge pole, dipping into his inkpot and writing in tiny tight demonic lettering. The imp finished writing and went over to its new totem and slid the page under it. It held up its two thick fleshy fingers, and a tiny purple-white hellflame danced between them. The imp lit the page on fire, and it burned with a blindingly bright purple-white flash, casting strange and evil shadows through the dark cellar. The stink of mildew was replaced with the stink of hot iron and sulfur. Whoosh! Crack! A second demon, with identical features and of identical size, blinked into existence a handspan above the newly bound totem. It gracelessly tumbled to the table, but energetically leapt back to its feet. Immediately the new imp started carving a fresh totem from the block of ebony. They worked with no words or gestures shared between them, each focused on their task. This was it. They can recursively summon themselves. Grigory had been especially worried about this part. Not one of the countless scrolls or tomes even suggested it was possible for a demon to summon a demon, but his equations had balanced. Spells based on untested theories were a reckless idea in any form of magic, but in demonology it was especially insane. There was a chance it hadn't ever been done. Not that demonologists would share their findings. Like his partially mad mentor had told him decades ago when he was first expanding into demonology, it's only insane if you fail. He leaned back to watch them with a slight furrow in his brow. He thought it was odd that they were literate in demonic. Something to look into later. He knew enough demonic to understand what was being written, but nowhere near the level to imbue a scroll of effect like they were using. That use alone seems incredibly useful. Perhaps literacy was just intrinsic to demons? Crack. The demonologist gleefully watched the work of what were now 4 demons, the latest 2 starting on their tasks as soon as their hooves landed on the table. Scratching his short beard, streaked with gray, he wondered if they were going to summon 10 total imps. Or maybe each imp summoned would make 10, which would never end. Maybe each imp will only carve the number of totems left in queue when it was summoned, which would be about 3.6 million imps. That's far fewer, but would probably be enough to cause problems. The imps worked noticeably faster as they gained experience. Fascinatingly, they seemed to learn as one. They would run out of ebony long before making millions of totems, but there were tales of demons summoned with human bones. He knew where plenty of those were, not that far under his skin. Something the imps, with their worldly knowledge, would also know. Probably enough for the few million totems in the surrounding towns and villages. The demonologist tensed as the 4 papers flashed blinding purple-white, followed by 4 loud cracks of binding. They landed on his bench and set to work. With a profound sigh of relief, he noticed that the imps organized themselves into 2 teams to quickly complete the final 2 totems. After the final double crack of binding, 10 new imps along with the original 1 placed their tools into the correct slots of the toolbox, closed it, then sat cross-legged on the workbench with their long legs and knobby knees overlapping. Oh! Safety! He'd forgotten the most important part. If not for the depth and breadth of the safety precautions he'd committed to, he'd have been done years ago. Safety was the linchpin to everything. Clearing off the tools and wiping away the ebony shavings, Grigory left the razor-sharp knife on the table. He unbuttoned his cuff, rolled up his sleeve, and put his left arm on the table. "Remove my smallest finger." "Nerp." Grigory nodded in relief. He noted that they didn't even look at the knife, and the refusal came the instant he finished speaking. Exactly as it should be. Grigory fixed his sleeve, adjusted his vest, and ran a sweaty hand through his short dark hair. Everything was progressing so well. The fear of being mined for his bones subsided. Grigory couldn't stop grinning. His smile grew wider and wider as he reflected on his success. All the overlapping enchantments and bindings worked out so elegantly. He basked in the glow of his success. Success beyond his wildest expectations. He leaned back to consider the implications. This will change everything. An end to drudgery. Every man, woman, and child will live better than the emperor. This will do more for quality of life than the sum total of every god, king, hero, and priest combined. There is so much suffering in the world, and almost all of it for the simple want of something his imps can provide. He knew that delusions of grandeur were a common road to madness, but also knew that his breakthrough today would affect more people than the invention of agriculture or the concept of writing. "Imps, fill my woodbox, make my bed, clean my house, and prepare me some roast chicken and boiled potatoes for dinner." In perfect unison, 11 imps squeaked merp. They energetically bounded off to run up the rough-hewed wood stairs into the one-room cottage Grigory had been living in for the past several months. Now that the hard part was done and his dreams were real, the demonologist realized he hadn't planned the next phase. Consorting with demons was a way to get burned at the stake anywhere the Church of the Eternal Triangle held sway, plus a great deal of other places as well. Those insipid morality tales that children everywhere were raised on made demons out to be dangerous. That might make it hard to get anyone to even want to command a swarm of demons. Even for free. Even to free themselves from drudgery and routine. Even if it were legal. Surely convincing people to embrace a better way of life won't be that hard. People are open-minded. They will behave like rational economic agents to maximize their quality of life. That'll be with domestic and industrial demons. The invisible hand will do the heavy lifting here. Grigory scooped up the totems, putting 10 pencil-sized and 1 truncheon-sized ebony carvings into his satchel, then headed upstairs to observe their work. 2 darted downstairs, between his legs, and hopped onto his stool, leapt to the table, then dragged his toolbox off the side of the table. It weighed at least 10 times as much as they did, but still they set to dragging it across the damp dirt floor to the base of the stairs. A few seconds later 2 more imps bounded down to help them. Together they lifted it onto their shoulders like 4 doll-sized pallbearers carrying an oversized coffin and darted the rest of the way up the stairs. Immediately they passed each other tools and set to work carving and building. Grigory trusted them to know what they needed, and he sat on the only chair in the dark room. He cast a gesture of flame to light his oil lamp and got out his notebook with problems to solve in his neat cursive script on the cover. He had left it open hours ago by his now cold boiled oats. Flipping to a new page, he started a brand new list. Long-term objectives. Improve the quality of life of all humans. Improve the quality of life of all sapients. Improve the quality of life of all living things. He looked up and saw his creations had already set up a tiny workshop by the firewood pile. They carved wooden tools appropriate to their size to start their tasks, tiny wood wheelbarrows and an access ramp up the edge of the woodbox. Such clever and hard-working little demons. Briefly imagining how all this might look to the eyes of excitable townsfolk, he added to his list. 4. Don't get executed. But that immediately seemed wrong, so he fixed the numbering. Long-term objectives. Don't get executed. Improve the quality of life of all humans. Improve the quality of life of all sapients. Improve the quality of life of all living things. He tapped the list a few times with the stylus. That's much more workable. All options to achieve this are basically impossible, but this morning making a perfectly safe demon was impossible. Now he had an infinitely scalable workforce. He updated the long-term goals yet again. Long-term objectives. Don't get executed for demon-based crimes or rebellion-based crimes. Don't get murdered by rivals. Improve the quality of life of all humans. Improve the quality of life of all sapients. Improve the quality of life of all living things. He closed his notebook and observed the imps sweeping up with tiny adorable brooms as other ones scrubbed the floor with tiny brushes and shallow bowls of warm soapy water. Grigory felt his confidence return. With imps like these, how could he possibly fail? Master demonologist Grigory Petrov Thiply woke up early feeling giddy with excitement. So much work to do. So many plans to put into action, and the sun was only a blush on the horizon. Taking stock of his current assets, he had a small cottage he didn't own, a dozen crates of books and manuscripts, one toolbox of demonologist's tools, a few normal tools, about 4 days' worth of food and 87 glendy in mostly copper and bronze coins. No connections with anyone powerful anywhere, and not really any friends in the village he'd been getting his supplies from. Clearly he needed a base of operations, some men at arms, and heaps of ebony for totems. The first impulse was to sell the miraculous demon totems, but that's just a way to take a short walk to the headsman's axe. Yesterday's discovery that the imps are themselves competent enchanters is probably going to be the core of this initial solution. Grigory had sold his horse and cart to pay for living expenses a few months ago. His remaining funds weren't close to enough to buy them back, let alone the supplies and protected cart to live in for a journey to the Glass Coast, the center of commerce and trade where the capital was. No one can become rich, powerful, nor safe in the wilds. He walked back down into his lab. Without anything to sell or trade for supplies, there really isn't much of a point to leaving yet. All 11 imps were patiently waiting on the desk. Eyes alert and unblinking, sitting cross-legged. Digging out a stack of blank paper and the small wooden box with his quills and a jar of iron gall ink, he thought about what kind of scrolls of effect a farmer would be interested in trading for. Then he remembered a druid spell he'd read about. Create a single scroll of rampant plant growth, he commanded the imps. Merp. The imp closest to the supplies quickly started jotting down line after line in demonic. Once it was done, it put away the stylus and sat back down. Grigory looked over the scroll. He didn't understand all the terms and spell structure, but he still was able to read all the syllables. Walking out to the small garden in front of the cottage, Grigory recited it line by line. The scroll remained intact and the garden unchanged. Remembering how the mostly mute demons activated them yesterday, he pulled a match out of his trouser pocket and lit the paper on fire. The paper burned the warm yellow-orange of a normal fire until it got within a finger breadth of the writing and promptly went out. Sighing with exasperation, Grigory summoned a spark of pure hellflame on his fingertip and tried yet again. Immediately the scroll burned blindingly brightly, even in the morning sun. All the plants within a dozen paces, including the trees across the path and the moss on the roof, writhed and moaned like they were in pain. Then the plants all wriggled and squirmed as they grew nightmarishly fast for a few seconds before laying still and silent again. The affected vegetation had grown to maturity, and the trees were noticeably taller and thicker. Concerningly, the heavy ripe vegetables were twisted and spiked, and the trees' leaves had all become jagged and sharp. The whole garden smelled of sulfur and hot iron. Combined with the requirements of Hellflame to activate, this might mean this wasn't going to be the scroll that would make him rich. Grigory walked back into the cottage and put on some water to boil to make a cup of tea and rethink his critical next steps. His normal source of income was to do scribe work or simple magic for commoners as he traveled, but that was too slow, too low yield. Scaling it up with his perfectly safe demons wasn't an option either. Even in a remote village in the wilds, inquisitors, witch hunters, and paladins would converge on reports of that sort of thing. What would make money without being obviously related to demons? As he stirred in a bit of honey to his tea, he felt a slight stab of regret. Gah, he should have had an imp make this tea. They are literally just sitting there. The broke demonologist stared at his tea in the worn chipped mug he'd had for years. The last of a set of very affordable thin red clay cups, and worried it was in fact a metaphor for his worn and eroded wealth. He fondly remembered having an entire matching set before he set off on his quest to create his magnum opus. Grigory idly dreamed of being able to afford a new matched set of mugs once he got some money. The kind with a slightly impractical shape and thick sides and a handle. Realization dawned on him as he made the same error in thinking in as many minutes. Why not have a demon do it? Demons can probably make fantastic mugs. A few quick commands later and the tiny imps sprinted off in every direction, looking for clay deposits nearby. An hour later they were building a simple kiln near a curve in the brook he'd been getting water from. He described the exact mug he wanted, and an imp would craft a single mug exactly as requested, but the first few weren't quite right. Minor changes in thickness, design, shape, and style at last resulted in a truly perfect mug. It had the right weight, a detailed nature scene on the side, and was easy to clean. Honestly, this was the best mug he'd ever held. A pleasant and unexpected side effect was the imps didn't use wood or coal in the kiln. Instead, they cured them with summoned hellfire, finishing dark gray mugs with a smooth, glossy iridescence that he'd never seen on any drinkware before. The sulfur smell faded quickly, and the hot iron smell didn't seem out of place on pottery. Everything about this was an ideal trade good to get the momentum started on his grander dreams. He spent the day giving tasks and clarifying specifics for work order after work order as the imps toiled tirelessly all through the day. By the time the sun was low in the west, he was headed home pulling a freshly built wooden handcart stacked with dozens of freshly carved wooden boxes full of sets of possibly the finest mugs in the known world. He gave instructions on exactly how he wanted the imps to make him dinner in his now spotlessly clean cottage, full of newfound confidence in how to structure work requests. Shortly after they got home and Grigory started planning tomorrow's trip to Fjallfield, a tiny village about a 3-hour walk to the east, he heard a distressed imp standing on the edge of the open meat box. "Nerp!" the sad imp cried, gesturing to the clay chest with an enchanted fridge stone in the bottom. Looking inside, Grigory immediately identified the issue. No meat. That meant it might be just a few spongy potatoes for dinner. This would have been a problem last week, but now he had options. Hunt 2 rabbits, skin them and tan their hides, then roast the meat with herbs. Nerp. Hunt 1 rabbit and bring it to me. Nerp. Set 5 rabbit traps and bring me what they catch. Nerp. The perfectly safe demons were being perfectly safe. On one hand, that's proof of a job well done, but on the other hand, that doesn't fill anyone's belly. He was still a demonologist of the highest skill and could summon a venom tyrant or barbed rage pummeler, but that probably wouldn't result in a good meal either, no matter how many woodland animals died nightmare deaths. Plus, the rituals would take longer than he was willing to wait for dinner. His plan was to improve the lot of everyone, making the whole idea of unleashing demons to make dinner slightly off-putting. Harvest all ripe vegetables in the garden and make a stew. Merp. Several demons darted out the door to set to work. It felt a bit like defeat, but at the same time, if the imps refused to even harm a woodland creature indirectly, that seemed like ironclad evidence of his success in creating his dream, the holy grail of his entire profession. A perfectly safe demon that had required no prices to be paid. Well, other than the materials and the totem, but that's not too expensive. Besides, that's not paid to any demonic forces, so that doesn't technically count. He watched with joy as the tiny imps moved vegetables that weighed as much as them with impressive speed and grace. They sliced them evenly and quickly added them into the pot of boiling water. One imp stood on the pot's rim stirring with a long-handled wooden spoon, entirely immune to the hot metal. Another imp ran deep into the forest and returned with some mushrooms and wild herbs. Even with all his academic understanding of what he was seeing, it was still deeply gratifying to see his hard work all function in the real world. To see his creations move and plan doing useful chores without needing any intervention. The stew itself, however, was almost inevitably sulfuric and was filled with barbed carrot thorns, misshapen pepper bones, and a few stinging tomatoes. Grigory sighed and thought it was just as well he gave up on demonic rampant plant growth scrolls early on. This would have absolutely gotten the wrong attention had he sold a few hundred to the farmers in the area. His shallow metal bowl had gained several spots of corrosion by the time he gave up on dinner. With a sigh, he went to bed on a mostly empty stomach, but still grinning with the excitement of his plans and being so close to such massive and lasting success. Demonologist Grigory set off shortly after dawn, his belly full of the last of his oats, and he put some stale bread in a bag for lunch. The creaking handcart full of boxes of mugs clanked and groaned as the 11 imps pulled on the cart handle while he walked a few steps behind to keep an eye on things. Leaving the demons at the cottage to guard his meager possessions was his first idea, but they wouldn't be able to fend off an overly curious squirrel with their excessive safety. Besides, if anyone saw a nest of demons, that would cause far more problems than it would prevent. Actually, now that their path was approaching the road, these demons might have to go. Stopping for a second, he gathered the totems up and outvoked them one at a time, each demon vanishing soundlessly. The obvious drawback was now he had to haul the heavy cart himself over the uneven mud and stone road, carefully easing his delicate cargo over the odd tree root. What was a 3-hour walk in the past took almost 5 this time. His undershirt was soaked through with sweat and his trousers caked with gray mud by the time he passed the first farmsteads on the outskirts of Fjallfjell. Grigory stopped in the shade of a leafy oak and pulled a comb out of his satchel. He straightened his salt and pepper beard and his dark brown hair, removing an alarming number of pine needles and moss strands. Looking at his old wooden comb with its missing teeth, Grigory added it to the mental list of things to be upgraded once he had some proper tools for the agile hands of his minions. He put the comb back and got out his handkerchief to wipe the sweat off his face and palms, then brushed off the shoulders of his vest and shirt, clearing dust and forest debris to make him look disheveled rather than feral. With a vigorous snap, he shook the cloth clean, wiped his black-framed glasses off, and stuffed the handkerchief into his vest pocket. With a sigh to clear his mind, he squared his shoulders and made the final leg of his trip. For the first time since starting his journey, he thought about the actual mechanics of how to sell these goods. Typically, he did business directly with a few of the farmers in the village as there wasn't a store to do business with. Knocking on every door in the tiny village to sell mugs seemed like a poor use of time, and these are alarmingly nice mugs. Actually alarming. People get murdered for nice boots in a place like this, and these are glossy iridescent mugs with original art that would look impressive on the emperor's table. That alone will raise questions about where these mugs are from. They might assume, as an almost penniless traveler, Grigory had stolen them. All it would take was the thinnest pretext to execute him and claim the goods for themselves. Grigory came to a full stop and started stroking his beard as he tried to think his way through this. There's an inn with a public house, and come to think of it, they probably will want the mugs more than any one farmer would. Grigory looked down at his muddy handcart, realizing it had nearly as many mugs as there were households in this tiny village. Obviously, there won't be enough buyers for that many at any price. He dismissed his more outlandish idea of claiming to be an exotic traveling prince selling heirlooms. That won't work in a village that knows him as a hedge wizard from the times he'd done odd jobs and traded for supplies. Thinking on it for a few seconds to form the barest skeleton of a plan, he resumed his walk to the village green and into the pub that sat on the edge of it. Grigory entered the low-ceilinged Plowman's Crown, the damp, slightly smoky air smelling of simple food and spilled beer. His eyes took a second to adjust from the noon sun to the dimness of the pub, even though the windows were open. Thankfully, the place was mostly empty, just two white-bearded farmers smoking pipes and speaking in low voices at one table. The demonologist had spent the night here a few times in the past and knew the owner, or at least had spoken to him a few times. The muddy wooden wheels rolling on the wooden floorboards made an embarrassingly loud grinding and creaking noise. Looking back at the 2 lines of mud he tracked in, he wished he had thought to wipe the mud off the wheels or even leave the cart outside. The owner emerged from the kitchen and looked deeply offended by the time he got to the counter, and the grinding and squeaking continued. The thick-chested former farmer with rough calloused hands and short cropped blonde hair didn't even look at Grigory, instead staring at the 2 lines of mud across an otherwise clean floor. "Good afternoon, Brawlins," Grigory said with as big of a smile and as much confidence as he could muster. "Oh, mighty master wizard. I see you are back," the publican drawled, slowly and with contempt, finally moving his gaze onto Grigory. "I assume you are here to tell me that you've mastered some sort of floor-cleaning spell?" No, I'm afraid that research is yet incomplete, but I am closer than many people think." "No, this time I've actually come to thank you and your entire village before I move on for good. I'm just glad your long and sweaty journey has improved my life already. I was just telling the boy that we was almost out of mud." The contempt was still there and thick, but with the thin ribbon of good-hearted sarcasm lightening it slightly. Even the ghost of a memory of a smile was at the very edges of his lips. "If you'll indulge me and listen to a long tale, I'd be happy to offer you a more useful token of esteem." Grigory patted the top box on his cart for emphasis. Brawlin's eyebrows moved the barest fraction, granting him permission to continue. "The real reason I've been up here all spring was to find specific reagents for a specific contract. A great prince of the southern seas, where the sun is so hot even the lizards wear hats, had asked for some custom drinkware that could magically keep a drink cool. Everyone knows the fridge stones can do that for weeks at a time, but he was asking for something more elegant and refined and much smaller. I was able to complete the contract after months of great effort, but the final step was challenging beyond belief. A quarter of them shattered, half were totally inert, and a quarter successfully held the enchantment. While they aren't the priceless artifacts that will be the envy of a dozen princedoms in the southern seas, the inert mugs are still perfectly serviceable to hold drinks, and they are fairly attractive." With a flourish, Grigory pulled one of the top boxes off his cart, slid the wooden lid open along the slot, and revealed 4 mugs packed in wooden shavings. Grigory gestured to the tavern keeper to pick one up. "Oh my," he said as he lifted one of them. The entire spectrum of light and delicate bands danced as he slowly rotated the mug. The imprint on that cup was of a fox in the woods stalking a bird. Both animals were captured in exquisite detail, the trees textured and vivid. Brawlin's eyes grew huge as the full value of such an item caught up with the visceral impact of the workmanship. "And you'd give me one of these here mugs, fare free, just as a thank you? For letting you stay here at full price like 3 times in total?" Brawlin asked incredulously. "Oh my no," replied Grigory. "You can have 20 boxes as a thank you," and moved several boxes right onto the counter. "You see they are pretty heavy, and I've got no real use for mugs on my long trip home," he continued. "This Souther Prince fella, are him and his goons going to be looking for this stuff?" asked the tavern keeper, who had a knack for noticing problems long before they darkened his door. "Long gone. His agent's carts picked up the real artifacts weeks ago, and they are likely on a ship and over the horizon already. Honestly, I didn't even tell him about the failure rate. I have a reputation to protect," Grigory replied. By now Brawlins had picked up the second mug in the set, and its imprint was the same scene but a few seconds later, with the fox ready to pounce. Holding such a masterwork in his rough hands felt almost like blasphemy. Grigory continued, "I hate to be a bother, and not to take up your time, but do you know of anyone that would trade me a horse and wagon for 15 more boxes of these mugs? There were some bad dealings with an apprentice, and I found myself without reliable transport back to the guild tower by the capital." In a show of enormous self-control, Brawlins pretended to think for several seconds, without a flicker of greed or excitement. Well, these parts are more unsavory than you'd expect. And I'd hate to see such an esteemed enchanter as yourself come to a bad end. How's about as a thank you, for your thank you, why don't I give you mine for those ones? I've got another horse and wagon anyhow, and I was thinking about selling one of them soon anyways, Brawlins said with genuine empathy and concern. Your kindness and generosity is more than I could have hoped for, Grigory said, in his best impression of a na-ve academic that doesn't understand the value of money. Which was extra compelling since it was less of an act than a spotlight his existing attributes. Well then, all that's left for the day is to sell these final few boxes of mugs for provisions and some coin for my trip. Oh, you'd buy and sell mugs for the pub all the time. Do you reckon 300 Glendy is fair? For a set, I mean. Someone would pay that to have some nice cups for their tea, I bet? Brawlin stepped forward. Won't hear of it. I'll take them off your hands for 350 a set. There are some regulars I'd be happy to gift them to. And to make your trip safe and comfortable, I'll even throw in our spare mattress and a few sacks of grains and potatoes. Tricking an out-of-touch academic out of a fortune is fine, but he honestly hoped he got home safely. The tavern keeper managed to not trip over a single word even as he was doing more mental math than he had in years. Conservatively, even to a middleman, it's likely a few thousand a set, and double or triple that to the right noble. He might have just traded a horse and some potatoes for a castle this afternoon. Oh, well, I guess you can have the handcart too, Grigory said as he gestured to the filthy thing. I certainly don't have any use for it now. And sorry about the mud, I honestly wasn't thinking. Don't give it a second thought. Why don't you sit right here? I'll get the kitchen to make you some lunch and I'll load your new wagon and hitch the horse, said the now sugary sweet tavern keeper, with fresh incentive to get him on his way. Brawlins came around the counter, calling to the kitchen to make a lunch special, then moving the few boxes from the counter back to the muddy cart. Brawlins quickly wiped down the wheels with a bar rag from his apron pocket and wheeled it into the back room. Grigory tried not to listen for the sound of sliding wood as each box was quickly checked just out of sight. He sipped the beer the server brought him in a plain red clay cup as he thought to himself that some of the very best scams are where each party scams the other. He was enjoying the last few bites of the sage sausage in a rich salty gravy when Brawlins returned. All set, friend. I meant to tell you before I went, I'm going to unveil the new mugs at the Harvest Festival in a few weeks, and it would mean a lot to me if you could keep this transaction to yourself so as not to ruin the surprise. For the kids, you know? I'll be rumbling out of here in a wagon in just a few minutes, so I can say with confidence not a soul will hear it from me. Oh, about that money? Grigory asked as if an afterthought. Of course. Of course. Here you are. The horse and a stable cat are kind of a bonded pair. Cat's never had an interest in mousing, but maybe he can be a familiar or something for you. As he spoke, he placed a stack of coins on the counter, including some of the fat electrum ones the accidentally ascetic mage hadn't touched in literal years. Oh, I guess, I've never really had a cat before. What's his name? Grigory asked as he dropped the coins into the secure triple-stitched pocket of his satchel, making a slightly musical noise as it hit the 10 small ebony totems he'd put there this morning. He was far too polite to say that the whole familiar thing is more a misconception from ostracized mages wanting companionship than anything magically useful. Oh, I ain't ever named a cat. I guess he's not minded so far, the innkeeper said with genuine surprise. Horse is named Buckwheat, though. I'm sure I'll figure something out with the cat, and thank you again for being so helpful. The commotion of Grigory getting on the wagon and woke up the fluffy black cat that was somehow already asleep on the seat. It sat up and looked slightly offended, but made no effort to move away. A quick pet and a gentle push to the passenger's side of the bench seat seemed to satisfy the cat, and he laid back down. You fit the part at the very least, and it might be time for me to have someone to bounce ideas off, Grigory told the cat as he guided the cart back to the cottage and to the glorious post-drudgery future.